The November wind cut through Westcliff, Colorado like a sharpened blade, and Xavier Kincaid noticed her the moment he stepped out of the general store with his supplies. She stood huddled against the storefront's wooden wall, arms wrapped tight around herself, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress that had seen better days, her dark hair whipping around a face gone pale with cold. Xavier's boots stopped moving of their own accord, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he watched her body tremble violently. Her lips tinged blue, and something in his chest twisted hard enough to make him forget about loading his wagon. He turned on his heel and walked straight back into Henderson's general store, the bell above the door jangling as warmth enveloped him again. Martha Henderson looked up from behind the counter, her round face creasing with curiosity as Xavier strode past the barrels of flour and salt toward the far wall where winter coats hung on wooden pegs. "Forget something, Xavier," Martha called out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Need a coat," Xavier said, his voice gruff as he examined the selection. His fingers touched a heavy wool coat in deep burgundy, well made with brass buttons and a thick lining that would hold warmth even in the worst mountain storms. He pulled it down and carried it to the counter, fishing coins from his pocket. Martha's eyebrows rose as she wrapped the coat in brown paper. "This is a woman's coat, Xavier. Didn't know you were keeping company with anyone." "I'm not," he said shortly, counting out the money. The coat was expensive, nearly 2 weeks of wages from his ranch work, but the image of that shivering girl wouldn't leave his mind. When he emerged from the store, the girl was still there, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear the sound from several feet away. Up close, he could see she was young, probably around 20 or 21, with striking features that would have been beautiful if not for the desperation carved into every line of her face. Her green eyes widened as he approached, and she pressed herself harder against the wall, clearly expecting trouble. "Easy now," Xavier said, keeping his voice low and calm the way he did with spooked horses. "I'm not here to cause you harm. Saw you shaking out here in the cold. Bought you this." He held out the wrapped package. The girl stared at him like he had grown a second head, her eyes darting from his face to the package and back again. "Why?" Her voice came out cracked and hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Because it's freezing and you don't have a coat," Xavier said simply. "Take it, please." Her hands emerged from where she had them tucked under her arms, fingers so cold they fumbled with the paper wrapping. When the burgundy wool spilled out, tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. She clutched the coat to her chest for a moment before Xavier helped her shrug it on, and the transformation was immediate. The coat swallowed her thin frame, but the color brought life back to her pale face. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was crying in earnest, great shaking sobs that had nothing to do with the cold. Xavier stood there awkwardly, a tall man of 26 who knew his way around cattle and horses, but had precious little experience with crying women. "You have somewhere to go." "Someone to help you." She shook her head violently, trying to wipe at her eyes with the 2 long sleeves of the coat. "No, nobody. I walked here from Cannon City 3 days ago. Thought I could find work, but everyone keeps turning me away." Cannon City was 40 miles south, a hard journey even with proper supplies and clothing. Xavier looked at this slip of a girl and felt anger kindle in his belly at whoever had left her in such desperate straits. "You eaten today?" Another shake of her head. "Come on then," Xavier said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "Let's get some food in you and figure out what's next." She followed him to the Silver Dollar Saloon like a lost shadow, keeping close but not touching, her new coat wrapped tight around her body. The saloon served hot meals during the day before the drinking crowd arrived, and Xavier guided her to a corner table away from prying eyes. He ordered beef stew and fresh bread for both of them, along with hot coffee that steamed in thick ceramic mugs. The girl fell on the food like she was starving, which she probably was, eating so fast Xavier worried she would make herself sick. "Slow down," he said gently. "Food's not going anywhere. Eat too fast and you'll just bring it back up." She forced herself to take smaller bites, her eyes never leaving her plate as though someone might snatch it away. Xavier ate his own meal more slowly, studying her over the rim of his coffee cup. Even half-starved and desperate, she had a quality about her that drew the eye, a natural grace in the way she moved her hands, an intelligence in those green eyes that suggested better circumstances in her past. "I'm Xavier," he said finally. "Xavier Kincaid. Work a ranch about 10 miles north of town." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something other than fear and desperation in her expression. Grace Calloway. "Well, Grace Calloway, what's your story? How does a young woman end up walking 40 miles in November with nothing but a summer dress?" Grace's hands tightened around her coffee mug, and for a moment, Xavier thought she wouldn't answer. Then the words spilled out in a rush, as though now that she had started, she couldn't hold them back. She had been living in Cannon City with her aunt after her parents died of influenza 2 years ago. The aunt was a bitter woman who had never wanted the responsibility of a niece, and when her own son returned from the war back east needing a place to stay, Grace had suddenly become unwelcome. Her aunt's son had made it clear he expected certain favors from Grace in exchange for allowing her to remain, favors Grace refused to provide. So she had left with nothing but the dress on her back and $3 in her pocket. "The money ran out yesterday," Grace said quietly, staring into her coffee. "I thought Westcliff might have work. Thought maybe someone would need a cook or a laundry woman or anything, but every door I knocked on got slammed in my face. I think they thought I was a soiled dove looking for respectable work." Xavier's jaw clenched. He knew how small towns could be, how quickly reputations could be ruined by nothing more than appearance and circumstance. A young woman alone, desperate, wearing a thin dress in November, it was easy for small minds to draw ugly conclusions. "Can you actually cook?" he asked. Grace looked up, and for the first time he saw hope flicker in her eyes. "Yes, I'm a good cook. I can clean, do laundry, mend clothes, tend a garden. My mother taught me everything before she passed." Xavier nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind that was either brilliant or completely foolish. "The ranch where I work, the Broken Arrow, it's owned by a man named Thomas Crawford. Good man, fair employer. He's been complaining for months that the bunkhouse cook quit, and the food's been terrible ever since. His daughter's been trying to manage it along with everything else, but she's got her hands full with 3 young children and a husband who works the ranch. If you're truly willing to work, I think I could get you a job there. It would come with room and board, small wages, but honest work." Grace's eyes went wide, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You would do that for me. You don't even know me." "I know you walked 40 miles rather than compromise yourself," Xavier said quietly. "I know you're willing to work for what you need instead of begging. That's enough for me to know you deserve a chance." She reached across the table and grabbed his hand, her fingers still cold despite the hot coffee. "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever seen. I promise. I'll repay this kindness somehow." Xavier felt the warmth of her touch travel up his arm and settle somewhere in his chest. "Just cook decent food and that'll be payment enough. The boys at the ranch have been suffering under burnt beans and hard biscuits for too long." They finished their meal, and Xavier led her to where his wagon waited, loaded with supplies. He helped her up onto the wooden seat, and Grace pulled her new coat tighter as Xavier clicked the reins, and the horses started the journey north toward the Broken Arrow Ranch. The road climbed steadily into the wet mountain valley, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising dramatically to the west, their peaks already white with early snow. Grace was quiet for most of the ride, her eyes taking in the vast landscape with something like wonder. Xavier found himself stealing glances at her profile, the way the wind had brought color back to her cheeks, the determined set of her jaw despite obvious exhaustion. There was something magnetic about her, something that made him want to know every detail of her story, every thought in her head. "It's beautiful here," Grace said softly as they crested a hill and the valley spread out before them. "I've never seen mountains like this." "Sangre de Cristo means blood of Christ in Spanish," Xavier said. "Named for the red color they turn at sunset. Wait until you see them on a clear evening. Takes your breath away every time." "Have you always lived here?" Grace asked, turning to look at him properly for the first time since they had left town. "Born in Missouri," Xavier said. "Came west with my father when I was 12, right after my mother died." He wanted a fresh start, somewhere the memories wouldn't choke him every time he turned around. "We worked our way through Kansas and into Colorado. He died 4 years ago, caught in a spring blizzard checking on new calves. Found him frozen the next morning, still holding a calf he'd been trying to save." "I'm sorry," Grace said, and Xavier could hear genuine sympathy in her voice. "It's hard losing parents." "It is," Xavier agreed. "But this land, this life, it's what he wanted for us. I stay because I love it, not just because of him. There's something about waking up to mountains and big sky that makes a man feel small and infinite at the same time." Grace nodded as though she understood, and they fell into a comfortable silence as the wagon rolled on. The Broken Arrow Ranch came into view as the afternoon sun started its descent. A sprawling collection of buildings nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees following the path of a creek. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure built from local timber, with smoke curling from 2 chimneys. The barn and outbuildings spread out behind it, and Xavier could see horses in the corrals and cattle dotting the distant pastures. Thomas Crawford emerged from the barn as Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house. He was a man in his 50s with a weathered face and keen blue eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes moved from Xavier to Grace with open curiosity. "Xavier," Thomas said in greeting, his voice carrying the rough warmth of a man who had spent his life outdoors. "Wasn't expecting you back with company." Xavier climbed down from the wagon and moved to help Grace descend, his hand spanning her waist as he lifted her down. She felt light as a bird, and he made a mental note to ensure she ate properly in the coming days. "Thomas, this is Grace Calloway. Grace, this is Thomas Crawford, owner of the Broken Arrow." Grace straightened her shoulders and met Thomas's gaze directly. "Mr. Crawford, I'm looking for work as a cook. Xavier said you might need one. I know I don't look like much right now, but I'm a hard worker and I can prepare meals that will stick to a man's ribs without poisoning him." Thomas's eyebrows rose, and then he let out a bark of laughter. "Well, that's a lower bar than we currently have, seeing as how the boys are half convinced the current situation might actually kill them. You have experience." "Cooked for my family for years, and I helped at a boarding house in Cannon City before my circumstances changed," Grace said, not flinching from Thomas's scrutiny. "I can make bread that doesn't double as a weapon, stew that doesn't taste like dishwater, and breakfast that will get your men through a hard day's work." Thomas looked at Xavier, one eyebrow raised in question. Xavier gave a small nod, and something in his expression must have communicated his trust in Grace, because Thomas turned back to her with a thoughtful expression. "Tell you what, Miss Calloway," Thomas said. You cook dinner for my family tonight and breakfast for the ranch hands tomorrow morning. If neither meal kills anyone and the boys don't complain more than usual, the job is yours. Room in the old cook's cabin, 3 meals a day for yourself, and $30 a month plus a bonus at year's end if you stay the whole time. Fair. More than fair, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. You won't regret this. Remains to be seen, Thomas said, but his tone was kind. Xavier, show Miss Calloway to the cook's cabin and help her get settled, then bring her up to the main house. My wife will show her the kitchen. The cook's cabin was a small structure near the bunkhouse, but separate enough to provide privacy. It had been empty since old Pete had quit 3 months ago, taking off for California with dreams of finding gold at his age. Inside was a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress, a small stove for heat, a table and chair, and pegs on the wall for hanging clothes. It wasn't much, but to Grace it might as well have been a palace. It's perfect, she whispered, running her hand along the back of the chair. I can't believe this is happening. This morning I thought I might freeze to death, and now I have a job and a place to stay and this beautiful coat. Xavier found himself smiling at her wonder. You earned it by being willing to work. Come on, let's get you introduced to Sarah Crawford. She'll be relieved to have kitchen help. She's been trying to manage meals for 20 ranch hands while taking care of 3 little ones, and it's been wearing her thin. Sarah Crawford was a woman in her early 30s with blonde hair pinned back in a practical bun and tired eyes that lit up when Xavier explained Grace's presence. She took Grace's hands in her own and squeezed gently. You're an answer to prayers, Sarah said warmly. I was starting to think we'd have a mutiny on our hands if the food didn't improve. Come, let me show you where everything is. Xavier left them to it, heading out to help the other ranch hands with evening chores. The Broken Arrow employed about 15 men year-round, with numbers swelling during spring branding and fall roundup. Most were good men, hard workers who appreciated decent food and fair wages. Xavier had worked there for 4 years, saving his money with dreams of eventually having his own place, a small ranch where he could build something lasting. As he worked, hauling feed and checking water troughs, Xavier found his thoughts drifting back to Grace. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin from the moment he saw her shivering outside that store. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was certainly lovely. It was the courage in her eyes, the way she had walked 40 miles rather than surrender her dignity, the fierce determination to make her own way in a world that didn't make things easy for women alone. The dinner bell rang at 6 o'clock, and Xavier headed to the main house with the rest of the hands. The dining room was a large space with 2 long tables where the men ate family style, passing platters and bowls while conversation flowed. The usual cook, a ranch hand named Jim who had been pressed into service, brought out his standard offering of beans that were somehow both burnt and undercooked, meat tough enough to sole boots, and biscuits that could be used as ammunition. But then Grace appeared from the kitchen, carrying a platter of golden roasted chicken that made every man at the table sit up straight. Sarah followed with bowls of mashed potatoes fluffy as clouds, rich brown gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, and a basket of biscuits that steamed when torn open and melted butter like they were supposed to. The silence that fell over the table was profound. Then one of the older hands, a man named Charlie with a gray mustache, took a bite of chicken and actually closed his eyes in appreciation. Lord have mercy, he breathed. I'd forgotten food could taste like this. Laughter rippled through the group, and then everyone was eating with enthusiasm, compliments flowing freely. Grace stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, her face flushed with pleasure at the reception. And when her eyes met Xavier's across the room, he felt that strange warmth in his chest intensify. After the meal, Thomas stood and tapped his glass with a spoon. "Men, I'd like to introduce Grace Calloway, our new cook. Seems like she's got the job if you all are agreeable." The resulting cheer was answer enough, and Grace ducked her head shyly as the men applauded. Xavier noticed her hands were trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the positive response, and he wanted nothing more than to walk over and take those hands in his, tell her everything would be all right now. The next morning, Xavier rose before dawn as always, dressing in the cold darkness of the bunkhouse. The other men stirred and groaned, reluctant to leave warm blankets, but the promise of decent breakfast had them moving faster than usual. Xavier splashed icy water on his face from the basin outside and headed toward the main house. Smoke was already rising from the kitchen chimney, and light glowed warm in the windows. Inside, Grace was a whirlwind of efficient activity, her hair tied back under a kerchief, flour dusting her arms as she pulled pan after pan of biscuits from the oven. A massive pot of oatmeal bubbled on the stove alongside a skillet of frying bacon and another of eggs. Coffee percolated in a pot large enough to serve an army. "Morning," Xavier said from the doorway, and Grace looked up with a smile that did strange things to his heart rate. "Good morning," she said. "Everything's almost ready. Could you help me carry some of these platters?" They worked together to bring food to the dining room, and soon the table was filled with men eating and talking and laughing. The atmosphere was completely different from the sullen, complaining mealtimes of recent months, and Xavier saw satisfaction in Thomas's face as he surveyed his crew. As the men finished and headed out to begin their work, Xavier lingered, helping Grace clear dishes. She tried to wave him away, insisting she could manage, but he ignored her protests and carried stacks of plates to the kitchen. "You don't have to help me," Grace said, pumping water into the large sink. "You have your own work to do. So do you, and you've been up since before dawn," Xavier pointed out. "Besides, I want to." Grace turned to look at him, sudsy water dripping from her hands. "Why are you being so kind to me? You bought me a coat, got me a job, and now you're washing dishes. I don't understand what you want from me." Xavier set down the plates and met her gaze directly. "I don't want anything from you, Grace. I saw someone in need and I helped." "That's what decent people do." "Most people aren't decent," Grace said quietly. "Most people look at someone like me and see something to use or discard." "Then most people are fools," Xavier said firmly. "You're worth more than that, Grace Calloway. And maybe if you stick around long enough, you'll believe it too." The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Grace cooked meals that had the ranch hands singing her praises, and in between she cleaned the cabin that was now her home, turning it into a cozy space with curtains made from flour sacks and wildflowers in a jar on the table. Xavier found excuses to help her whenever he could, carrying heavy bags of flour, splitting wood for her stove, fixing the door that had been sticking. They talked during those stolen moments, conversations that ranged from the mundane to the profound. Grace told him about her childhood in Cannon City, about her mother who had been gentle and loving, her father who had worked in the mines and died when they collapsed 2 years before the influenza took her mother. She spoke of her aunt with careful neutrality, never saying anything truly harsh, but painting a picture of a cold woman who had seen Grace as a burden rather than family. Xavier shared his own stories, tales of growing up in Missouri, the journey west with his father, the hard lessons learned working cattle and horses. He told her about the ranch he dreamed of owning someday, a place where he could build something lasting, raise a family, leave a legacy beyond just surviving. "You'll have it," Grace said with conviction as they sat on the steps of her cabin one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains red and gold. "I can tell you're the kind of man who achieves what he sets his mind to." "Maybe," Xavier said. "But it takes time and money, and both are in short supply." "Time you have plenty of," Grace pointed out. "And money comes with patience and hard work. You're still young, Xavier. Your whole life is ahead of you." He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her dark hair and turned her green eyes luminous, and realized with sudden clarity that he was falling in love with her. The realization should have terrified him, but instead it felt right, like something that had been inevitable from the moment he saw her shivering outside that store. Winter settled over the wet mountain valley with serious intent, bringing snow that piled in drifts against buildings and turned the landscape into a pristine white wonderland. The ranch work shifted to winter tasks: feeding cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, maintaining equipment, and keeping everyone fed and warm. Grace's importance to the ranch became undeniable as her hot meals and fresh bread became the bright spot in long, cold days. Xavier found himself spending more time with Grace, and nobody seemed to think anything of it. He helped her haul water when the pump froze, kept her wood pile stocked, and walked her back to her cabin after evening meals when the darkness came early and complete. They talked about everything and nothing, their friendship deepening into something neither of them named but both felt. It was Sarah Crawford, who finally said what everyone else was thinking. She pulled Xavier aside one December afternoon as he was heading out to check fence lines and fixed him with a knowing look. "You care for her," Sarah said simply. "Grace, you care for her." Xavier felt heat climb his neck despite the cold. "She's a good woman, a good cook." "She's more than that to you," Sarah said gently. "I see how you look at her, Xavier, like she's the sun and you've been living in shadow. And I see how she looks at you too, like you're the answer to every prayer she didn't dare speak out loud." "It's too soon," Xavier protested. "She's only been here a few months. She's still finding her feet, figuring out her life. The last thing she needs is some cowboy complicating things." Sarah laughed, the sound warm and kind. "Xavier Kincaid, you're many things, but a complication isn't one of them. You're steady and good and exactly what that girl needs. Don't let fear keep you from happiness. Lord knows life's too short and uncertain for that." Her words stayed with him as he rode the fence line, checking for damage from the snow. Was he being a coward, not telling Grace how he felt? Or was he being smart, giving her time to establish herself without pressure from him? He didn't want her to feel obligated to him because he had helped her. He wanted her to choose him freely, if she chose him at all. Christmas came to the Broken Arrow with quiet celebration. Sarah and Grace worked together to prepare a feast for Christmas Eve, filling the main house with smells of roasting turkey, ham, fresh rolls, sweet potatoes, and half a dozen pies. Thomas distributed bonuses to all the hands, and there was music and laughter as someone produced a fiddle and another, a harmonica. Xavier had agonized over what to give Grace, finally settling on a new pair of leather gloves lined with soft wool, practical but nice, something she needed but wouldn't buy for herself. He wrapped them carefully in brown paper tied with string and waited until the party was winding down to approach her. Grace was in the kitchen, scrubbing the last of the serving dishes, her face flushed from the heat of the stoves and the pleasure of a successful meal. She looked up when Xavier entered and smiled, that radiant smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "Merry Christmas," Xavier said, suddenly awkward as he held out the package. "Got you something. Hope you don't mind." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and took the package with gentle reverence as though it were something precious. When she unwrapped the gloves, tears filled her eyes. "Xavier, they're beautiful. You shouldn't have spent your money on me. I wanted to, he said simply. You deserve nice things, Grace. She pulled the gloves on, flexing her fingers in the soft leather. Then, before Xavier could react, she stepped forward and hugged him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her head resting against his chest. Xavier froze for a heartbeat, then slowly brought his arms around her, holding her close as something inside him settled into place. Thank you, Grace whispered against his shirt. Not just for the gloves, for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for giving me a chance when no one else would, for being my friend when I desperately needed one. You saved my life, Xavier. You saved your own life, Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. You had the courage to walk away from a bad situation. You had the strength to keep going when things were hardest. I just bought you a coat. Grace pulled back far enough to look up at him, her green eyes shining. You bought me more than a coat. You bought me hope. They stood there, locked in each other's gaze, and Xavier felt the moment stretch and deepen, becoming something significant. He raised one hand to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. Grace, I need you to know something. What? She whispered. But before he could speak, Charlie burst into the kitchen, slightly drunk and completely oblivious, shouting about someone needing to come settle an argument about whether Texas or Colorado had better cattle. The moment shattered, and Grace stepped back, straightening her apron and wiping at her eyes. Xavier wanted to curse Charlie's timing, but he simply followed the older man out, glancing back to see Grace watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The winter deepened, and January brought storms that kept everyone close to the ranch buildings. Grace continued to cook meals that nourished both body and spirit, and Xavier continued to find reasons to be near her. But that moment in the kitchen on Christmas Eve hung between them, unfinished business that neither knew quite how to resolve. It was Grace who finally broke the stalemate. She appeared at the barn one afternoon where Xavier was repairing tack, her new coat buttoned against the cold, determination in every line of her body. We need to talk, she announced, and Xavier's heart kicked into a gallop. He set down the bridle he had been working on and gave her his full attention. All right, what about? About what's happening between us, Grace said, crossing her arms. About the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. About the way I look for you every time I hear footsteps outside my cabin. About Christmas Eve and what you were going to say before Charlie interrupted. Xavier stood slowly, dusting his hands on his pants. What do you want me to say, Grace? The truth, she said simply. I've had enough of dancing around things, enough of not saying what's real. Life's too uncertain, too hard to waste time on games. So tell me the truth, Xavier Kincaid. What do you want from me? The directness of the question stole his breath for a moment. Then he found his courage and spoke from his heart. I want everything. I want to court you properly, take you to church on Sundays and dances on Saturday nights. I want to bring you wildflowers in spring and make sure you're warm in winter. I want to hear your voice first thing in the morning and last thing at night. I want to build that ranch I dream about with you beside me, build a life that means something. I want to marry you, Grace, if you'll have me. I know it's too soon. I know you might not feel the same way, but you asked for truth and that's mine. Grace's eyes had grown wider with every word, and tears were streaming down her face by the time he finished. For a horrible moment, Xavier thought he had misjudged everything, that his declaration had been unwelcome. Then Grace closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands. Yes, she said fiercely. Yes to all of it. Court me, marry me, build a life with me. I've been half in love with you since you put that coat around my shoulders, and I've been all the way in love with you since you washed dishes in my kitchen and told me I was worth more than I thought. So yes, Xavier. Yes to everything. Xavier let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as joy flooded through him. She fit against him perfectly, like she had been made to be there, and when she tilted her face up, he lowered his head and kissed her for the first time. The kiss was gentle, almost chaste, a promise rather than a demand. Grace's lips were soft under his, and she made a small sound of contentment that Xavier felt all the way to his toes. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Grace was smiling through her tears. "I never thought I could have this," she whispered. "Never thought someone would want me not like this, not for real." "I want you for real," Xavier said firmly, "for always. You're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I count myself the luckiest man alive that you walked into my life." They stood there in the barn, holding each other as snow began to fall outside, and Xavier felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. This was right. This was his future, his home, his heart. Thomas and Sarah were delighted when Xavier asked permission to court Grace officially. Thomas clapped him on the shoulder and said he had been wondering how long it would take Xavier to work up his nerve, while Sarah hugged Grace and started planning their wedding before they had even set a date. The courtship was both sweet and unconventional. Ranch life didn't allow for the typical social outings of young couples in town, but Xavier and Grace made their own traditions. He took her riding on his gentlest horse, showing her the far corners of the ranch, the secret places he loved. They sat by the creek in the cold winter sunshine, talking about their dreams and fears and everything in between. He taught her to play cards, and she taught him the words to songs her mother had sung. On Saturday nights, if the weather permitted, Xavier would hitch up the wagon and drive Grace into Westcliff for the town dances held at the community hall. Grace wore her burgundy coat over a simple dress Sarah had helped her make, and Xavier wore his best shirt and cleanest pants. They danced together until their feet hurt, laughing and spinning, and Xavier basked in the envious looks other men cast his way. It was at one of these dances in late February that they encountered Grace's past in the form of her cousin, William Calloway. He was a weasel of a man with shifty eyes and a cruel mouth, and Xavier disliked him on sight. William approached Grace as she stood getting punch, his presence making her stiffen and go pale. "Well, well," William said, his voice oily. "Look what we have here." Little Grace, all dressed up and looking respectable, heard you ran off and found yourself a position. "Mama's been worried sick." "No, she hasn't," Grace said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear Xavier could see in her eyes. "And I didn't run off. I left because I refused to be your whore." William's face darkened with anger. "Careful, cousin. You're throwing around ugly words that could damage your reputation. This cowboy of yours know what kind of girl you really are. Know that you're nothing but a charity case." Xavier had heard enough. He stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and her cousin, his considerable height and breadth making William take an involuntary step back. "I know exactly what kind of woman Grace is. She's the kind who has the courage to stand up for herself. The kind who works hard and treats people with respect. The kind who's too good for sorry excuses like you. Now I suggest you leave before I forget we're in polite company." William's eyes darted between Xavier and Grace, and Xavier could see him calculating whether to push the issue. Whatever he saw in Xavier's face made him back down. "Fine, but you'll come crawling back eventually, Grace. Girls like you always do." "Girls like me build better lives," Grace said, her voice clear and strong, "and I already have. Goodbye, William." They watched him slink away, and then Grace turned to Xavier with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I never wanted you to be exposed to that ugliness." "That wasn't ugliness," Xavier said gently, pulling her close. "That was just proof of how far you've come, and how much courage it took. I'm proud of you, Grace." She buried her face in his chest, and Xavier held her as the dance continued around them, making a silent vow to always protect her, always stand between her and anyone who tried to make her feel small. As winter gave way to spring, Xavier began seriously planning for their future. He spoke with Thomas about saving his wages, about looking for land to purchase. Thomas surprised him by offering to sell Xavier 100 acres on the eastern edge of the Broken Arrow, good grazing land with a creek running through it. For a price Xavier could manage with his savings, and a loan Thomas offered at generous terms. "You're a good man and a hard worker," Thomas said when Xavier tried to protest the favorable deal. "And you're going to be Grace's husband. I'd rather have you as a neighbor than see you leave entirely. Build your ranch, Xavier. Build your dream. Just don't take my best cook too far away." Xavier accepted with gratitude that made his voice thick, and that evening he took Grace to see the land that would be theirs. They stood on a small rise overlooking rolling grassland with the mountains rising in the distance, and Xavier painted a picture of what he saw in his mind's eye. "A house there, facing the mountains so we can watch the sunrise. Barn over there near the creek for easy water. Corrals for horses, pasture for cattle. It'll take time to build, years probably, but we'll get there together. What do you think?" Grace turned to him with stars in her eyes. "I think it's perfect. I think anywhere with you would be perfect." Xavier pulled a small box from his pocket, his heart hammering. Inside was a simple gold band he had purchased in town, nothing fancy but solid and real. "Grace Calloway, will you marry me? Will you build this life with me, be my partner and my wife? Let me spend every day trying to make you happy." "Yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, yes, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, catching the late afternoon light. Then he kissed her, pouring every bit of love and hope and promise he possessed into that kiss, and Grace kissed him back with equal fervor. They were married in early May, when the valley was green with new growth, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows in riotous color. The ceremony took place at the small church in Westcliff, with Thomas and Sarah standing as witnesses, and the entire ranch crew in attendance along with half the town. Grace wore a simple white dress Sarah had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers Xavier had picked that morning. Xavier wore a new suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable, but the look in Grace's eyes when she saw him made every bit of discomfort worthwhile. Reverend Mitchell performed the ceremony, speaking about love and commitment and building lives together. But Xavier barely heard the words. His entire focus was on Grace, on the woman who had appeared in his life like a gift and changed everything. When it came time to say his vows, Xavier spoke from the heart. "Grace, I promise to love you every day for the rest of my life. I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, to be your shelter when storms come and your companion when skies are clear. I promise to work hard to build us a good life, to make you proud, to never let you doubt your worth. You saved me as much as I saved you, and I'm grateful every day that I saw you shivering outside that store because it led me to you." Grace was crying openly, and her voice shook when she spoke her own vows. "Xavier, I promise to love you with everything I am. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your home. I promise to work beside you, to believe in your dreams, to build our life together with joy and gratitude. You gave me hope when I had none, safety when I was afraid, love when I thought I was unlovable. I will spend my life showing you that your faith in me was not misplaced." When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife and Xavier kissed his bride, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. They walked down the aisle hand in hand, Mr. and Mrs. Xavier Kincaid, and Xavier felt like his heart might burst from happiness. The reception was held at the Broken Arrow, with tables set up outside under the spring sunshine. Grace had worked with Sarah to prepare a feast, and there was music and dancing and laughter that lasted well into the evening. Xavier danced with his wife, holding her close, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair, and knew that this was what contentment felt like. Their wedding night was spent in the cook's cabin, which Grace had transformed with wildflowers and candles. They came together with tenderness and passion, and afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Xavier held Grace close and whispered promises against her hair. "I'll build you a house with a big kitchen where you can bake bread every day. With a bedroom that has windows facing the mountains so you can wake up to that view. With a porch where we can sit on summer evenings and watch our children play." "Our children," Grace repeated softly, her hand finding his. "I like the sound of that. How many children do you want?" "As many as you'll give me," Xavier said. 2, 4, a dozen. I don't care as long as they're ours." Grace laughed, the sound pure joy. "Let's start with one and see how it goes." They spent the next months dividing their time between working at the Broken Arrow and building their own place. Xavier worked from dawn to dusk, using every spare moment to raise the frame of their house with help from the ranch hands who had become his friends. Grace continued cooking for the ranch while saving every penny of her wages toward furnishing their home. By late summer, the house was finished enough to move into. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms that would eventually expand, but it had a solid roof, windows that let in light, and a stone fireplace Xavier had built with his own hands. Grace hung curtains and arranged the few pieces of furniture they owned, and when Xavier carried her over the threshold on their first night in their own home, she cried happy tears. "It's perfect," she said, looking around at the rough walls and simple furnishings. "It's absolutely perfect because it's ours." They made love in front of the fireplace that night, christening their home, and Xavier felt a completion he had never known before. This was what he had been working toward his entire adult life. Not just land or a house, but a home filled with love, a partner to share everything with, a future bright with possibility. Grace discovered she was pregnant in October, during roundup season. She told Xavier one evening after dinner, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly, her eyes shining with joy and a touch of nervousness. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Happy didn't begin to cover what Xavier felt. He let out a whoop of pure joy and swept Grace into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop before she got dizzy. "Happy? I'm over the moon. Grace, we're going to be parents." They spent the evening making plans, talking about names and whether it would be a boy or girl and what kind of parents they wanted to be. Xavier was determined to be present and involved, the kind of father his own dad had been, loving and supportive and always there when needed. The winter was hard, with snow that piled high and temperatures that dropped below 0 for weeks at a time. But their little house stayed warm and Grace bloomed with pregnancy, her figure rounding, her face glowing with health. Xavier was endlessly fascinated by the changes in her body. The way she placed her hand on her belly when the baby moved, the way she hummed while working in the kitchen. They had moved Grace's cooking operations to their own home, as she could no longer manage the walk back and forth from the Broken Arrow in her condition. Sarah had hired a new cook, a widow from Denver who needed the work, and Grace focused on preparing for motherhood. In early March, during a brief warm spell that hinted at coming spring, Grace went into labor. Sarah came to help, experienced with birthing after having 3 children of her own, and she sent Xavier to boil water and fetch clean linens and generally stay out of the way while she helped Grace through the process. Xavier paced outside, listening to Grace's cries, feeling utterly helpless. Thomas had ridden out when Sarah summoned him, and he stood with Xavier, placing a steady hand on the younger man's shoulder. "First time's always the hardest," Thomas said. "On the mother and the father both, but Grace is strong. She'll be fine." Hours passed, and Xavier wore a path in the dirt with his pacing. Then, just as the sun was setting, painting the mountains red and gold, a baby's cry split the air. Xavier's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Xavier. A big, healthy boy with his father's lungs. Come meet him." Xavier stumbled into the bedroom on legs gone weak with relief. Grace lay propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. Xavier approached like he was in church, reverent and awed, and when Grace pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face, dark hair plastered to a small head, Xavier felt tears stream down his face. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, touching one impossibly small hand with his finger. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his, and Xavier's heart was lost completely. "Grace, he's absolutely perfect. He looks like you," Grace said softly, smiling up at her husband. "I was thinking we could name him after your father, Samuel, if you agree." "Samuel Kincaid," Xavier said, testing the name. "I love it. Pa would have been so proud." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Grace transferred the baby to his arms. Xavier held his son with careful reverence, this tiny person who was half him and half the woman he loved, and felt the weight of responsibility and joy in equal measure. "I promise I'll be a good father to you," Xavier whispered to Samuel. "I promise to teach you right from wrong, to show you how to work hard and love deeply, to give you a good life. You'll never doubt that you're wanted, son. Never doubt that you're loved." Samuel made a small snuffling sound, and both his parents laughed, delighted by every tiny movement and expression. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew from infant to toddler, a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. The ranch prospered as Xavier's careful management and hard work paid off. They added cattle each year, expanded the house to include more bedrooms, built a proper barn and corrals. Grace gave birth to a daughter when Samuel was 3, a beautiful girl they named Lily, who had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. 2 years after that came another son, James, completing their family in a way that felt exactly right. The house was always full of noise and laughter, with children running and playing, Grace singing while she worked, Xavier coming in from the fields to swing his kids in the air and kiss his wife. They attended church on Sundays, went to town dances, became respected members of the Westcliff community. Grace never forgot where she had come from, and she made a point of helping other women in difficult circumstances. When a young widow showed up in town with nowhere to go, Grace offered her work and a place to stay until she got on her feet. When a girl barely 18 appeared pregnant and alone, Grace took her in without judgment and helped her find a path forward. "You're doing for them what I did for you," Xavier told her one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, his arm around her shoulders. "You saved my life," Grace said simply. "The least I can do is help others when I can." On their 10th anniversary, Xavier surprised Grace by taking her back to Westcliff, to the spot outside Henderson's general store where he had first seen her. The store was still there, though Martha Henderson had passed on and her son ran it now. "10 years ago, I walked out of that store and saw you standing right here, shivering in the cold," Xavier said, pulling Grace close. I had no idea that buying you a coat would change my entire life, that you would become my wife, the mother of my children, my partner in every way that matters. Best money I ever spent, that coat, Grace laughed, wiping at happy tears. I still have it, you know, tucked away in the trunk at the foot of our bed. I could never bear to get rid of it. It represents the moment my life changed, the moment I met the man who would become my everything. I love you, Xavier said, kissing her temple. Today, tomorrow, forever. You're my heart, Grace Kincaid. And you're mine, Grace replied, turning in his arms to kiss him properly. Always and forever. They stood there as the sun set. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life of love and purpose, who had turned a single act of kindness into a legacy that would last generations. Years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the expansion of their ranch. Samuel grew into a serious young man who loved the land as much as his father did, while Lily was bright and curious, always asking questions and reading every book she could get her hands on. James was the family clown, keeping everyone laughing with his antics and boundless energy. Thomas and Sarah remained close friends, their children growing up alongside the Kincaid kids. The Broken Arrow and the Kincaid Ranch operated in friendly cooperation, helping each other during busy seasons, sharing resources and knowledge. When Samuel turned 18, he took over more of the ranch responsibilities, working side by side with his father. Xavier taught him everything he knew about cattle and horses, about managing land and weather, about treating people with respect and earning respect in return. He told Samuel the story of how he met his mother, wanting his son to understand that kindness could change lives, that love was worth fighting for, that doing the right thing mattered even when it was hard. Lily went away to Denver for schooling, much to her father's mixed feelings. Xavier was proud of her intelligence and ambition, but worried about his little girl in the big city. Grace reminded him that Lily had a good head on her shoulders and a strong sense of self, gifts they had given her by loving her well and teaching her to value herself. James stayed on the ranch, developing a gift with horses that surpassed even his father's considerable skill. He could gentle the wildest Mustang with patience and understanding, and soon people from neighboring counties were bringing him horses to train. As Xavier entered his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes from years of sun and wind, he sometimes stood on his porch in the early morning, coffee in hand, and marveled at the life he had built. The scared young woman shivering outside a store had become the strong, confident matriarch of a thriving family. The lonely cowboy with dreams of his own place had built not just a ranch but a legacy. Grace joined him on the porch most mornings, her own hair streaked with silver but her green eyes as bright as ever. She would wrap her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his back, and they would stand in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in shades of crimson and gold. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked one morning. Choosing this life, this hard land, a cowboy with more dreams than money, Grace came around to face him, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "Regret you? Regret our life together? Never, Xavier, not for one single moment. You gave me everything that matters. Love, family, purpose, home. You saw me when I was invisible and gave me a chance when no one else would. How could I possibly regret the man who saved my life and then made that life worth living?" Xavier kissed her, and it was as sweet and full of promise as their first kiss in the barn all those years ago. Some things, the important things, never changed. When Samuel married a local girl named Emma, bringing her home to the ranch, Xavier understood how his own father must have felt, watching the next generation begin their journey. Samuel and Emma built a house on the western edge of the property, and soon the sound of grandchildren filled the air. Lily returned from Denver with a teaching certificate and opened a school in Westcliff, educating the children of ranchers and shopkeepers alike. She remained unmarried, claiming she was too busy and too particular, though Grace suspected her daughter was simply waiting for someone who matched her father, someone steady and good and worth the wait. James married young, to a spirited girl from Texas who matched him joke for joke and loved horses as much as he did. They settled on the northern section of the ranch, building their own small empire of trained horses that were in demand across Colorado. As Xavier and Grace entered their 60s, they gradually turned more of the ranch operations over to their children, spending their days in gentler pursuits. Grace still cooked, though now for a smaller household, and she spent hours in the garden she had expanded over the years. Xavier helped with lighter tasks, mentored his grandchildren, and spent long hours on the porch with Grace, holding her hand and counting his blessings. "I'm writing a memoir," Grace announced one evening as they sat watching yet another spectacular sunset. "I want our grandchildren to know the whole story, where we came from, how we found each other. I want them to understand that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to show kindness to change everything." Xavier smiled, squeezing her hand. "Tell them the truth. That I saw the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen shivering in the cold, and I couldn't walk away. Tell them that buying a coat was the easiest decision I ever made, because something in me recognized something in you. Tell them that love doesn't always come easy or simple, but when it's real, it's worth every sacrifice." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. The mountains stood eternal against the horizon, the same mountains that had witnessed their first meeting, their first kiss, the building of their life together. "You think they understand how lucky we are?" Grace asked quietly. "The children, the grandchildren. Do they know how rare it is to have what we have?" "They'll understand when they're older," Xavier said. "When they've lived enough life to know that true love is precious and rare. But we can show them now, by how we treat each other, by the life we've built. That's the real legacy, Grace. Not the land or the cattle or the money. It's the love we've shared and the example we've set." As they entered their 70s, Xavier and Grace became the patriarch and matriarch not just of their own family, but of the wider community. People sought their advice on everything from marriage troubles to ranch management. They were respected and beloved, known for their generosity, their wisdom, and the deep love that was still evident every time they looked at each other. Grace's memoir was published by a small Denver press, and it became a treasured record not just for their family, but for others who read it, and found hope in the story of two people who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from a single act of kindness. On a warm June evening, when they had been married for 52 years, Xavier and Grace sat on their porch surrounded by 3 generations of family. Samuel and Emma were there with their 5 children, the oldest now 20, and engaged to be married. Lily had finally found her match in a widowed banker from Denver, a kind man who loved her independence and matched her intelligence, and they sat holding hands, still in the early glow of courtship at age 48. James and his wife had 4 children, all of whom had inherited their parents' love of horses. Someone brought out a fiddle, and soon there was music and dancing in the front yard as the sun set in glory over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Xavier stood and held out his hand to Grace, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. They danced slowly, swaying more than truly dancing, their bodies knowing each other so well that movement was instinctive. "Thank you," Xavier said quietly, his lips near her ear. "For saying yes. For choosing me. For building this life with me. For never leaving my side." Grace pulled back far enough to look into his eyes, her own shining with tears and love. "I never left your side because I never wanted to be anywhere else. You're my home, Xavier. You always have been. From the moment you put that coat around my shoulders, I knew I was home." They kissed, gentle and sweet, as their family danced around them and the mountains stood watch. It was a perfect moment, the culmination of a lifetime of perfect moments, strung together like pearls on a chain. Xavier and Grace lived well into their 80s, vital and engaged, still holding hands on the porch, still finishing each other's sentences, still so clearly in love that it made people smile to see them. When Grace's health began to fail, Xavier never left her side, caring for her with the same devotion he had shown their entire marriage. When she passed peacefully in her sleep one winter morning, Xavier held her hand and whispered that he would see her soon, that their story wasn't over, just paused. Xavier lived another 2 years, long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren born, long enough to ensure the ranch would continue under Samuel's capable management, long enough to finish his own written account of their life together to complement Grace's memoir. When he died on a spring morning, sitting in his chair on the porch with the mountains glowing pink and gold before him, there was a smile on his face. The family buried them side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple marker that read, "Xavier and Grace Kincaid." He bought her a coat, and she never left his side. Their love story became legend in the wet mountain valley, passed down through generations, a reminder that kindness can change lives, that love can transform everything, and that sometimes the smallest gesture can be the beginning of the greatest adventure. The ranch continued to prosper, managed by the descendants of the cowboy and the girl he saw shivering outside a store on a cold November day in 1874. The house they built still stood, expanded and updated but retaining its essential character. Grace's garden still bloomed every spring. The burgundy coat, carefully preserved, was displayed in a glass case in the living room, a tangible reminder of where it all began. And on quiet evenings, when the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset paint the Sangre de Cristo Mountains red and gold, they told the story again. The story of how love could spring from a single act of kindness. How a desperate young woman and a compassionate cowboy found each other and built a legacy that would last generations. How sometimes the most important decision you ever make is to stop and help someone in need, because you never know who might become your forever. The Kincaid family remained pillars of the Westcliff community for over a century, and every generation made sure their children knew the story of Xavier and Grace. Knew that love was worth fighting for, that kindness mattered, that doing the right thing even when it was hard could change not just your life, but the lives of everyone who came after. In the end, Xavier Kincaid's dream came true in ways he never could have imagined. He did build his ranch, did create a legacy, did have a family that carried on his values and his name. But more than that, he had loved and been loved completely, and he had proven that sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person willing to see someone else's need and meet it without expecting anything in return. The coat he bought that cold November day was just wool and thread and buttons. But what it represented, the hope and love and future it symbolized, that was eternal. That was everything. And generations later, the story of the cowboy who saw her shivering outside the store, who bought her a coat, and who won her heart, continued to inspire and remind people that love could spring from the smallest seeds and grow into something magnificent.